In the bitter winter of 1887, deep within the frozen woodlands of Michigan, a company of lumberjacks descended upon the ancient pine forests to harvest timber for the season. They came with axes and crosscut saws, with determination hardened by necessity, and with the confidence of men who believed themselves masters of the wilderness. By day, they felled towering white pines that had stood for generations. By night, they huddled within their rough timber shanty, seeking warmth against the relentless cold that gripped Wexford County. At first, there was nothing to disturb the rhythm of their labor beyond the howling wind and the endless silence of deep snow. The forest seemed as any other, indifferent, vast, and waiting. But as the days grew shorter and the nights stretched longer, small disturbances began to creep into the edges of their awareness. Tracks appeared in the snow that were too long and too strangely formed to belong to any wolf. Sounds carried through the darkness that seemed to hold two voices simultaneously, one layered atop the other in an unnatural harmony that chilled the blood. When men began to vanish without trace, the truth of what stalked them through those frozen woods became impossible to ignore. What had begun as an ordinary season of timber work transformed into a desperate struggle for survival against something that defied all natural explanation. This is the account of those terrible weeks, as told by one of the two men who lived to speak of it. I secured employment as a sawyer in late December of 1887, when the snow still lay thick and unyielding across the whole of Wexford County and every creek and stream remained locked beneath sheets of ice. Our logging camp was established near an extensive cedar swamp, positioned several miles distant from the main tote road that served as our connection to civilization. Our task was straightforward: to fell white pine and hemlock throughout the winter months and transport the timber by horse-drawn sledge to the river landing, where it would await the spring thaw. The logging company provided each man with coarse woolen blankets, a bunk in the communal shanty, and wages of $20 per month with board included. We arrived at the site equipped with crosscut saws, felling axes, peavies for rolling logs, and a cast iron stove for the shanty that produced more smoke than heat on windless days. The draft oxen bellowed mournfully each morning as the cold bit into their flesh, and our teamster cursed steadily through the woolen scarf wrapped about his face. The frigid air sliced at one's mouth and throat, making every breath a sharp discomfort. I had labored in other logging camps across Michigan and Wisconsin, but the marsh surrounding this particular site possessed an oppressive stillness that seemed to press upon one's ears, as though the very forest were holding its breath. Our foreman was a man named Harland Pike, broad-shouldered, economical with words, and possessed of an instinctive ability to position himself wherever trouble might be brewing before it could fully materialize. He enforced strict discipline within the camp: no card games after 10 o'clock, absolutely no spirits or liquor of any kind, not even a small nip against the cold. He announced that he would dock any man's wages for a broken tool handle if the breakage resulted from carelessness rather than honest accident. He assigned me to work a 6-foot crosscut saw alongside a man called Tom Voss, who possessed a strong back and an unfortunate habit of talking incessantly whilst we worked the saw back and forth through the massive trunks. Eli Sturgis bunked nearest to the stove, an older hand with a steady cutting rhythm and a small, worn Bible that he kept carefully folded within a square of shirt cloth. Baptiste Clare served as our most skilled riverman, short and quick-moving with a distinctive scar along his jawline. A man named Auer drove the oxen and seemed to possess an uncanny understanding of their temperament and moods. Silas Shaw ranged the trap lines and brought in fresh venison when the company's salt pork began to turn blue-green at the edges. The youngest amongst us was simply called Jude, lean and eager, experiencing his first full season of timber work. We constructed the shanty in just 2 days, rough-hewn plank walls and a steeply pitched roof designed to vent the smoke from our stove. The camp cook, a taciturn fellow named Nels, boiled coffee that tasted strongly of iron and poured it black and bitter. He kept a pot of beans simmering constantly on the back of the stove and spoke very little to anyone. We commenced our labor each morning at first light. The deep snow supported our weight well as we moved across the frozen hummocks and uneven ground. When the steel wedges finally cracked through a massive trunk, the sound rang clear and sharp through the still air, echoing off the distant trees. At midday, We ate salt pork and dense bread with crusts so hard they fought against one's teeth. By the conclusion of our second week, timber was stacking neatly at our river landing, and Pike remarked that we would easily make our quota provided no early thaw arrived to complicate the spring drive. But trouble, when it arrived, did not announce itself with a shout or obvious alarm. Instead, it crept into our camp through small, disturbing details that some men noticed before others, though all of us eventually felt the growing unease. It began on a Thursday in mid-January. Silas returned from checking his trap line near the cedar swamp and reported finding a deer carcass torn apart in a manner he'd never witnessed in 30 years of wilderness living. The dead animal hung suspended in the tangled branches of a low snag, positioned as though placed there deliberately by hands that cared nothing for whether it might fall. The ribcage had been cracked open with tremendous force, and the internal organs were missing. Most disturbing, however, was the complete absence of any recognizable pattern in the tracks surrounding the kill site. No wolf pack had circled it in the methodical manner one would expect. No bear had left its distinctive claw marks. Silas crouched over the disturbed snow for several long minutes, studying the marks with growing confusion. Finally, he touched one impression in the snow with his bare fingertip, as though physical contact might help him understand what he was seeing. "No wolf made that track," he said quietly, his breath steaming in the cold air. He pointed out the stride pattern to Pike. The spacing between prints was far too long, and they were arranged in a configuration he could not identify despite his extensive experience. Pike examined the site briefly and suggested, with somewhat forced confidence, that a bear must have woken from its winter torpor and left confused, irregular tracks. Silas shook his head slowly but offered no argument. He simply cut short his explanation and fell silent. The rest of us hauled that day's logs to the landing with our thoughts turned decidedly inward, each man wrestling privately with what this discovery might mean. That evening, the wind died completely and the cedar swamp fell into an absolute stillness. We lay in our rough bunks with our boots positioned near the stove to dry. Then, as darkness settled fully over the forest, a sound rose from the low ground and carried directly into the rafters of our shanty. It was unlike any animal cry I had ever heard, not a single clean howl such as a wolf might make, but rather a low note underneath a higher cry, both emanating simultaneously as though produced by a single throat holding two distinct voices. The sound made the hair on my neck stand rigid. Men pushed themselves up on their elbows and listened intently, eyes wide in the dim light from the stove. Voss laughed nervously and suggested that a sick wolf had found unusual breath, but his voice lacked conviction. Eli Sturgis did not speak at all. He simply held his worn Bible pressed tightly against his chest and breathed slowly and deliberately, as though controlling rising panic through sheer will. I felt the muscles in my neck tightening involuntarily. There was a camp dog, a mottled cur we called Blue, and he immediately began whining in clear distress until Nels kicked the floorboards near him and ordered him harshly to be silent. The dog obeyed but continued trembling violently for the remainder of the night. The following day's work proceeded normally enough on the surface, but Silas returned from his morning trap line inspection with troubling news. One of his steel traps had been sprung and severely bent out of shape. He swore emphatically that he had set it properly and securely. The bait had vanished completely, and the chain had carved a deep groove into the sapling it was attached to, suggesting tremendous strain. Most puzzling was the complete absence of tooth marks or claw marks that might explain how the trap had been warped so dramatically. Pike instructed him curtly to reset his trap line further north and to stop dwelling on mysteries. Near the edge of the cedar swamp, a sharp, unpleasant smell began to permeate the air, something that did not belong in that place. The odor was acrid and old simultaneously, turning one's stomach in a subtle but persistent manner. None of the men mentioned it aloud, but I noticed we were all watching the tree line far too frequently and swinging our saws with uneven, distracted rhythm until Pike snapped at us to maintain proper pace. The second night brought a repetition of that uncanny sound, but this time it seemed to move, drawing closer, then receding to a distance, then approaching once more. Blue scratched frantically at the shanty door, desperate to be let out or perhaps to flee entirely. Our sat upright in his bunk and reached instinctively for his boot, muttering what might have been a prayer or a curse under his breath before catching himself. The cast iron stove ticked and creaked as the metal contracted in the cold. When the sound finally passed away into the darkness, men lay back down in their bunks, but genuine sleep eluded everyone. I found myself counting the breaths of my companions, waiting for them to settle into the deep, even rhythm of true rest, which never quite came. When I finally managed to slip into an uneasy doze, I dreamt of footsteps moving steadily above us where the roof rafters met the walls, measured, deliberate, and patient. I woke with the taste of iron flooding my mouth, as though I'd been sucking on a nail. Morning light revealed that Blue had disappeared entirely. The rope we'd used to secure him to a bunk post lay frayed and torn, but not cut cleanly as though by a blade. Dark drops of what could only be blood had frozen into small crimson beads in the snow, catching the early light like scattered garnets. The trail of blood led approximately 5 paces from the shanty and then simply stopped, as though the dog had been lifted bodily into the air. Voss suggested with forced joviality that Blue had pulled hard enough to abrade his paw raw and then bolted off following the scent of a female in heat. His grin was tight and artificial. Young Jude asked tentatively whether we shouldn't organize a search for the animal. Pike told him flatly to eat his breakfast and prepare for the day's hauling. He stated firmly that no man would leave the cutting area to search for a dog, regardless of sentiment. I felt anger rise hot in my chest at this callousness, but then the feeling cooled as rational thought reasserted itself. I recognized that Pike was not wrong in his decision. He was simply being a practical foreman responsible for keeping his crew focused and safe. Still, the empty space beside the shanty door where Blue had habitually waited made the entire camp feel exposed and vulnerable. At our midday meal, Auer confided to us in a barely audible voice that he had witnessed something deeply unsettling on the tote road at first light. He had gone out early to examine the sledge runners for damage. Whilst performing this inspection, he'd seen a tall figure cross the empty path where it cut between the dense spruce trees. The figure had moved upright on 2 legs, walking as a man would walk, but something about it was fundamentally wrong. It had turned its head once in his direction, and he'd clearly seen ears rising from the skull, not human ears, but something more like those of a wolf or large dog, yet positioned on a decidedly humanoid skull. Auer held his work-roughened hands apart to demonstrate the width of the creature's shoulders, which far exceeded any normal human proportions. His hands trembled visibly as he did so. Voss attempted to dismiss his account, suggesting loudly that Auer had merely glimpsed a man wearing a fur cap and had been deceived by the early morning shadows. Auer shook his head slowly and said in a voice barely above a whisper that the arms had hung well below where human hips would naturally be, a proportion that could not possibly fit any man. He swallowed hard and looked down at his untouched food, unable to meet our eyes. That evening, Pike walked a careful perimeter around our camp with Silas accompanying him. They returned after full darkness had fallen, Pike's face set in hard, expressionless lines. He instructed us curtly to bring additional firewood inside the shanty and to stack it near the stove. He did not explain why. When we moved to secure the door for the night, we discovered 4 deep parallel marks gouged into the wooden plank near the latch. The grooves cut cleanly through the grain and stood at approximately the height of a man's chest. The wood had curled outward along each furrow, indicating that tremendous pressure had been applied. Pike ran his thumb slowly along one groove, examining it in the lamplight. He announced that a porcupine had obviously tested the door, attracted by the salt from our hands that had seeped into the wood grain. Not a single man responded to this transparent fabrication. Eli carefully placed his Bible beneath his straw-filled mattress tick and positioned his boots immediately beside his bunk, as though preparing to move rapidly before his eyes could fully open in an emergency. The following day, Silas requested assistance checking the northern section of his trapline. I volunteered to accompany him, grateful for something to do that might distract from the growing tension in camp. We moved past the cedar stand where he'd discovered the mutilated deer carcass. The air remained perfectly still, and the snow compressed with a soft crunching sound beneath our boots. Silas showed me a location where 2 clear prints had pressed deeply into the snow whilst the surrounding impressions had barely marked the frozen crust at all, suggesting that weight had shifted forward in preparation for a tremendous leap. The prints themselves were disturbingly long, far longer than any wolf track. The heel portion sat narrow and defined, whilst the front spread into 4 distinct sections where weight had been distributed. Most troubling was the complete absence of claw marks where one would absolutely expect to find them. Instead, there were only smooth pressure lines in the snow, as though whatever made these tracks possessed something more akin to fingers or toes than paws. Silas did not attempt to name what might have left such marks. He simply stated quietly that we should return to camp immediately. On our way back, we passed a mature fir tree with bark stripped away in 4 parallel lines running from approximately shoulder height to well above the reach of any normal man. Fresh resin bled from the wounds in the wood. I measured the height using the handle of my felling axe as a gauge. The topmost scratch extended 2 full hand-widths above the axe handle when I held it at full reach above my head. By dusk, dense clouds had moved in to cover the sky, creating a pale, oppressive lid over the forest. Nels set out venison stew for our supper, dark, thick, and rich, but the men ate in near total silence. When the cast iron stove popped and cracked from the heat, every head turned sharply toward the sound. Young Jude asked tentatively whether the logging company might consider relocating us to a camp further south if an early thaw seemed imminent. No one bothered to answer him. After we'd settled into our bunks for the night, that sound came once more, closer than ever before. This time a second voice rose beneath the first, lower in pitch and considerably rougher in timbre. The dual cry circled our shanty once in a slow, deliberate circuit, and then fell silent beyond the wall. We could hear planks creaking under some tremendous weight. A breath moved beneath the door gap, carrying with it that same sharp, ancient smell we'd noticed near the cedar swamp. Someone retched quietly into his blanket and then attempted to muffle the sound. Morning brought crystalline light and brittle cold that burned in one's lungs. The marks on the door had deepened noticeably overnight. The iron latch showed a new bend in its metal, as though something had tested its strength. Outside, the latrine door hung precariously from a single hinge, and the post to which it had been secured displayed what could only be described as bite marks, but they were far too large to belong to any bear, and the wrong shape entirely for a wolf's jaws. The draft oxen shifted nervously in their traces and rolled their eyes, showing the whites in clear distress. Ours stood with them for a long while, speaking in a low, soothing voice in an attempt to calm their agitation. Pike called us to work with a tone that explicitly discouraged any questions. We walked to the cutting area with an uncomfortable sense that the road behind us had somehow changed, though none of us could have articulated precisely how. We fell into the familiar rhythm of the crosscut saw and attempted to drive our troubled thoughts into the repetitive work. The massive pine groaned as the wedges finally split through its heartwood, and the tree fell true to our mark. It felt genuinely good to stand over such clean, honest work. It represented something we could understand and control in a situation that was rapidly slipping beyond comprehension. But when we began limbering the fallen trunk, stripping away its branches, Jude called out sharply from the far side. A track had crossed the bed of pine needles whilst we'd been actively working. Whatever made it had placed 1 foot directly upon the clean wood of the newly felled trunk and then stepped off again on the opposite side. The prints stood out clearly in the sticky sap that had bled from the severed branches. It possessed that same disturbing configuration, the elongated heel, the spread front divided into 4 distinct sections. Men gathered round and stood staring down at the mark until our collective breath steamed over it and blurred its edges. Pike sent us back to haul the day's cut with an abruptness that bordered on panic. He instructed Jude specifically to keep his eyes on both the ground and the overhead branches simultaneously, a telling admission that we were being watched by something that might attack from any direction. Near dusk, Silas failed to return at his expected time. He departed to check the trap lines beyond the cedar hump, accompanied by Baptiste for safety. Baptiste came running back into camp near full darkness with his cap off and his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reported that he'd lost sight of Silas at the edge of the swamp when the light had gone flat and gray. He'd heard a sound in the dense brush, a sound he explicitly stated he could not identify, which was remarkable given Baptiste's extensive wilderness experience. He'd called Silas's name repeatedly, but received no response whatsoever. Pike immediately pulled on his heavy coat. He instructed 5 men to fetch lanterns, told Nels to keep the stove well stoked, and looked directly at me, saying I should take the rear position in our search line. My mouth went completely dry, but I nodded and checked the oil level in my lamp. We set off into the darkness, 6 men carrying 3 lanterns between us. Pike took point with Baptiste at his shoulder. I walked behind them with young Jude at my side. Voss and Eli brought up the rear of our line. The night possessed no wind whatsoever, and the snow made a thin, grinding sound beneath our boots. We passed the cedar hump and moved into progressively darker ground beyond it. Pike raised his hand at intervals, signaling us to halt whilst he listened intently. The lanterns threw small, inadequate circles of yellow light whilst leaving everything beyond that radius uncertain and threatening. Baptiste kept glancing repeatedly to his left, as though expecting a shadow to detach itself from the tree line and move toward us. At the edge of the swamp proper, we discovered Silas's trail where it ran straight and purposeful for a considerable distance before beginning to wander erratically, as though he'd changed his mind about his destination or had seen something that required investigation. Pike crouched low and traced one line with his gloved hand, pointing out a scuff mark where Silas's heel had slipped unexpectedly. He offered no verbal comment. We followed the meandering tracks as they swung toward a section of deadfall, fallen trees creating a tangled barrier. There we discovered Silas's cap, pushed down into the snow with considerable force. A dark smear extended approximately 4 feet from the cap and then simply terminated. Baptiste stood over this evidence with his mouth hanging open. Young Jude swallowed audibly and tightened his grip on his lantern handle until his knuckles showed white. We spread out into a careful, deliberate line and moved cautiously beyond the deadfall. Now there were 2 distinct sets of tracks visible in our lantern light. One set clearly belonged to Silas. We recognized his particular boot pattern. The second set pressed down far apart, showing much greater depth at the forward portion. They had approached from the side and merged with Silas's path. The snow appeared packed hard where the 2 trails met, as though a struggle or sudden stop had occurred. A few strides further, the tracks grew mysteriously shallow, and then Silas's footprints cut off entirely, as though he'd been lifted bodily from the ground. The snow showed a distinct channel where weight had pushed down and then released. Pike walked the next 10 feet in complete silence, his lantern held high. The second set of tracks curved away into the darkness. Dark drops on the snow crust had frozen hard, drops that could only be blood. Pike touched one frozen drop with the back of his glove and then stood upright. He announced flatly that we were returning to camp immediately. Baptiste's face worked with barely suppressed emotion. He stated that he'd only left Silas alone for a single minute. He'd turned because he heard movement behind him, and when he'd looked back, there was nothing. Eli told him sharply to hold his tongue until we were safely inside the shanty. Pike placed a hand briefly on Baptiste's shoulder in a gesture of comfort, then removed it and began walking. We kept our lanterns partially shaded during the return journey. Once, something moved through the brush approximately 30 yards distant and froze when we froze. The snow compressed with a faint crunching sound, and then silence fell absolute. Young Jude breathed through his mouth in short, panicked gasps. Voss muttered unconvincingly that it was merely a moose that had become separated from its herd. No one responded to this obvious falsehood. Back at the shanty, Pike counted us twice to ensure no one else had gone missing. He instructed Nels to prepare strong coffee and told the rest of us to sit. He announced that no man was to venture outside alone until first light returned. He organized watches at the door in rotating pairs, 2 men at a time. I drew the second watch with Jude as my partner. Before we settled down, Eli asked Pike quietly whether he would be willing to lead morning prayer before we commenced work. Pike shook his head and suggested that Eli could offer prayers at the table if he felt so inclined. Eli nodded without pressing the matter further. During the first watch, a sound moved slowly across our roof, a ponderous weight that tested the structural beams and then lifted away. Snow slid down from the eaves in a rush. Voss and Auer stood by the door with felling axes gripped in white-knuckled hands. They looked at each other, then up at the ceiling, then back at each other. The sound passed over and moved away. In the silence that followed, we heard a low exhalation near the wall by the stove, followed by a light scraping against the dried moss chinking between the logs. Eli whispered a line from his Bible and then fell completely silent. When my watch turn arrived, I felt my hands begin to tremble and pressed them firmly against my thighs until the tremor subsided. Jude kept his eyes fixed unwaveringly on the door latch. He asked me quietly whether this was truly man's work we were facing. I replied honestly that I did not believe so. He asked whether it would come through the door. I told him that the bar would hold long enough for someone to raise an alarm. He nodded and adjusted his coat more tightly around himself. An hour passed with nothing more than the stove ticking as metal contracted and the wet, labored breathing of sleeping men. Near the conclusion of our watch, a shape moved past the frosted window, a dark silhouette that blocked the minimal light filtering through the ice crystals. It paused and appeared to turn, as though studying the shanty. The frost thinned perceptibly where warm breath touched it from the exterior. Jude raised his lantern higher, and the shape slid smoothly away without producing any sound whatsoever. We did not wake the other men. We did not speak of what we'd witnessed. When Voss and Auer came to relieve us, Jude simply stated that the watch hours had been quiet. It was technically true, nothing had actually attacked. At daybreak, Pike gathered us together and spoke with uncomfortable directness. He stated plainly that Silas was gone, presumably dead, though he did not say so explicitly. He said we would conduct another search once the light grew sufficiently strong, but we would absolutely not split into individual searchers. He announced that if the search proved fruitless, we would resume our timber work because the company did not pay us wages to stand idle. His voice possessed a sharp edge I'd never heard before. It sounded forced, as though he were fighting something beneath the words themselves. Eli opened his worn Bible and read a brief passage in a flat, emotionless tone that did nothing to settle the room's atmosphere. Baptiste refused to eat breakfast. Nels placed a bowl of porridge before him regardless and physically placed a spoon in his hand. We divided into two search groups. Pike led one party with Baptiste, Voss, and Eli. I accompanied Auer and Jude in the second group. We walked along the swamp's edge where we'd discovered the tracks the previous night. The morning light provided better visibility of both the ground and the surrounding tree trunks. We found where the second set of tracks had crossed a narrow stream. The prints pressed deeply into the near bank but appeared strangely light on the far side, as though whatever made them had cleared the distance without effort. Voss stood with his hands planted on his hips and stared up at a thick branch overhanging the stream. The branch showed fresh damage. It was cracked and hanging at an unnatural angle. He looked back down at the tracks and closed his mouth without comment. We discovered no further sign of Silas beyond those ominous tracks. The snow held a few dark drops of what might have been blood, and then nothing. We circled until noon and then returned to camp by a longer, more circuitous route. Along the way, we found one of Silas's steel traps 30 yards off where it should have been, snapped completely shut and folded in upon itself. The chain was kinked severely. The wooden bait stick had been split cleanly in half. Eli picked up the mangled trap and turned it slowly in his hands, examining it from multiple angles. He stated quietly that no man had destroyed that trap using only his fingers. He set it carefully back down and wiped his palms repeatedly on his coat, as though the trap had contaminated him. When we reached the shanty, Pike's group had already returned. Baptiste stood near the door with his shoulders hunched defensively and his eyes fixed on the ground. Auer sat on a sledge runner and ran his thumb along a deep groove worn into the wood. Pike reported that they'd found nothing beyond additional track crossings and old sign. He announced that we would keep the oxen confined close to camp and bar all doors after darkness fell. He instructed us to work the nearest timber stand that afternoon to keep our hands occupied and our minds from dwelling on our situation. We cut timber at perhaps half our normal pace. No one spoke except to mark a step or call the direction of a fall. Our saw strokes grew progressively more ragged when sounds from the swamp broke through the steady rhythm of our work. The sounds were not particularly loud, merely low calls close to the ground, answered by second calls from further back in the depths. They possessed a measured rise and fall that matched no animal cry I had ever encountered. Jude's saw blade slipped and bit into his glove, drawing blood. He hissed through clenched teeth and shook his hand. Blood spotted the pristine snow at his feet. He wrapped a strip of cloth tightly around the wound and set his jaw, refusing to show weakness. By sundown, the sky displayed a thin band of clear light along the western horizon before dulling once more into gray monotony. We brought in firewood and water and repositioned the sledges into a tight defensive ring near our camp. Pike strung a rope from the shanty door to the cookhouse so that no one would lose the path should our lights fail. He instructed Nels to bank the stove low but to keep coffee perpetually available. He organized watches again, longer shifts this time, and posted Baptiste with Eli for the first watch. He paired Voss with me and kept young Jude inside to rest his injured hand. Our volunteered for a double watch shift. The first portion of the night held without incident. The second watch shattered when a commotion erupted amongst the oxen. They shifted their massive weight and blew forcefully through their nostrils. One released a strained, tortured low that brought every man instantly to his feet. Pike lifted the door bar and cracked the door open cautiously. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it a thick smell of animal hide, dung, and something else, something musky and ancient that raised the hair on my neck. Pike signaled silently with 2 fingers. Voss and I accompanied him outside, moving slowly along the guide rope. Our boots sank into the snow and squeaked with each step. The lantern light caught steam rising from the agitated animals' bodies. Their eyes rolled to show the whites in unmistakable terror. Then we saw it, positioned beyond the nearest sledge at the very edge of our lantern's reach. It stood perfectly upright and motionless, as still as a tree stump. The lantern light failed to illuminate its face clearly, but I could discern the line of an elongated muzzle and the distinct rise of lupin ears. The shoulders were massively broad. The arms hung far longer than any human arms should hang. The hands, and they were hands, not paws, opened and closed once with an unsettling dry sound, like leather rubbing against leather. When it turned its head toward us, the lantern caught the reflection in its eyes for a single, terrible instant. They shone back at us with a flat color entirely devoid of warmth or anything approaching human emotion. Behind it, additional shapes moved between the trees with deliberate care. I counted 2 distinct forms, then a third. Each moved with predatory patience. Pike raised his felling axe handle in his left hand. He spoke without raising his voice above conversational volume, which somehow made his words more frightening. He told us to step backward toward the door. He said explicitly not to run. The creature took a single stride that covered an impossible distance, then stopped as though testing our reaction to this display. Baptiste shouted from the shanty doorway, telling us to hold our position. Eli called out a warning. The oxen bumped heavily against the sledge, and one massive animal fell to one knee before scrambling upright again. The creature's head turned toward the sound of distress, then swiveled back to face us directly. It exhaled forcefully, and the air clouded in the bitter cold. It stepped sideways and vanished beyond our lantern's reach as though it had never existed. We backed to the door and slid inside rapidly. Pike dropped the heavy bar into place. The room held a tight, suffocating silence broken only by harsh, rapid breathing that gradually settled. Our hands shook so violently that he tucked them beneath his thighs to hide the tremor. Jude stared fixedly at the floor, his face drained of all color. Voss released a long, shuddering breath and seemed not to notice the sound he made. Eli closed his eyes and nodded once, as though receiving confirmation of a terrible fact he'd been anticipating. The oxen eventually settled after a long, tense hour. No attack materialized. At dawn, we discovered that the nearest sledge bore deep parallel scratches running along the main beam. The yoke pin on one pair of oxen had been tested and turned halfway round in its socket. Tracks marked the snow at the edge of our defensive ring, those same elongated heel prints with the 4-part spread front, arranged in a broken oval completely surrounding where the animals had stood. Further out, we found where one of the shapes had knelt. The mark showed a clear impression of tremendous weight concentrated on one knee. Most disturbing, the snow there had melted and refrozen, as though whatever knelt had possessed body heat far exceeding any normal animal's temperature. Pike examined this evidence for a long time without speaking. Finally, He called us together and announced that we would relocate our entire camp to the river landing by noon. He stated we would work from that more open location and abandon the swamp edge entirely. He told us to pack efficiently and to leave nothing behind that could be used or destroyed by the creatures. He said we would bring the oxen in close and maintain watches throughout the day as well as night. Voss began to argue about the time we would lose, but Pike silenced him with a single look of such intensity that Voss stepped back. Baptiste began moving and packing without uttering a word. We packed throughout the morning with frantic efficiency. Jude rolled blankets one-handed whilst keeping his eyes fixed on the door. Eli wrapped his precious Bible in shirtcloth and tucked it securely inside his coat. Nels tied provision sacks and lifted the heavy iron kettle with both hands. Our kept one hand constantly on each ox while speaking to them in a low, soothing voice. I carried saws and peavies to the sledge and checked their teeth from pure habit, finding comfort in familiar routine. The work steadied my nerves, but only superficially. We set off in a single-file line, sledges creaking ominously. The path to the landing cut through a dense stand of spruce and then over a shallow rise. The trees there stood close together, blocking any side view and creating an oppressive sense of enclosure. Pike walked ahead with his axe gripped tightly in his right hand. Baptiste and I managed the first sledge whilst Voss and Eli followed with the second. Jude and Auer kept the oxen moving in steady rhythm. The sound of the runners scraping across the frozen crust covered the smaller sounds emanating from the brush on either side. Twice I thought I heard footfalls that precisely matched our pace before falling back into silence. I did not speak of it. The rise ahead seemed considerably farther than I remembered from previous journeys. We finally reached the summit and saw the opening beyond. The river landing lay below us, with the dark line of the frozen channel cutting through the white expanse. Relief moved through our group in small, visible signs. Our shoulders eased slightly. Jude exhaled audibly. Voss rubbed his hands together in anticipation of reaching relative safety. We started down the slope. Without warning, the first sledge jerked violently to the left. Something had caught the runner with tremendous force. I looked back and saw a line of fresh tracks approaching at an angle and crossing directly over our trail. The oxen balked in terror and then surged forward chaotically. The second sledge bumped hard and tilted at a dangerous angle. Eli stumbled and went down heavily on one knee. He cried out once in pain. 3 shapes burst from the tree line on our right, moving with shocking speed and staying low to the ground. I saw massive shoulders, elongated heads, and arms reaching forward with clear intent. Pike shouted wordlessly and ran at them with his axe raised high. I dropped the peavey I'd been carrying and grabbed Eli by his coat collar. His leg dragged uselessly. He shouted that his ankle had turned badly. Baptiste swung his logging hook in a wide arc and struck one shape across the forearm. It pulled back with a sharp, inhuman sound and then came on again immediately. Its hand opened and closed with that disturbing dry snap. Its teeth showed when it pulled its lips back in what might have been a snarl or grin. It reached for the nearest ox. Auer brought the heavy butt of a yoke pinned down on its head with all his strength. The sound was sickeningly flat, bone meeting iron. The creature reeled backwards but recovered with impossible speed. A second beast took the far side of our defensive position and set a hand deliberately on the sledge beam. It tested the weight methodically, then pushed with calculated force. The beam cracked loudly. Pike struck downward and his axe buried itself to the haft in one creature's shoulder. The beast yanked back violently, and the axe tore free with a wet, tearing sound. It turned with a sudden pivot that revealed the powerful muscles in its back working beneath hide and coarse fur. It reached for Pike with both hands. Pike stepped away with controlled precision and set his blade deep in its ribs. The creature fell to one knee, then pushed itself upright again using both hands planted in the snow. Its eyes met mine for a single heartbeat. There was clear intelligence in them and intent, but not anger or rage. It was hunting with purpose and calculation. It looked from me to the panicked oxen and then beyond me to something else I couldn't see. Then it dropped its head and charged directly at Pike. The charge broke completely through the sledge beam and sent the oxen stumbling forward in absolute terror. The trace line snapped with a sound like a pistol shot. The animals bolted down the slope with the damaged sledge bouncing wildly behind them. Baptiste shouted and attempted to grab the trailing trace, but it whipped past his grasping hands. The sledge bounced and scattered tools across the pristine snow. The sound of the runners gradually faded into the open ground below. Pike stood braced with blood splattered across his coat, his axe held high in a defensive posture. The wounded creature pulled itself backward and moved into the tree line with a heavy, staggering gait, but the other two pressed closer with clear determination. Eli clung to me desperately, his ankle twisted and swelling rapidly. His face had gone gray with pain, and he gasped between words. Voss dropped beside us and lifted Eli's arm over his shoulder. "Get him up," he said, his tone clipped but without panic. Together, we dragged Eli toward the second sledge whilst Jude shouted for Hour to hold the team steady. The oxen pawed the ground and tossed their massive heads, clearly sensing the weight of what pressed in upon us. Their eyes rolled to show the whites, and steam poured from their flared nostrils. One of the creatures lunged suddenly at Baptiste. He struck it squarely across the jaw with his iron hook, and the teeth of the implement tore deep furrows that leaked dark, almost black blood. The thing staggered under the blow, then snapped its head back with an audible crack of vertebrae. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, and it produced a sound that vibrated deep in the chest, a sound that seemed to resonate in my own ribcage. The third creature circled behind our position with clear tactical intent. Pike barked Baptiste's name sharply. Baptiste wheeled just in time, but the creature came in beneath his swing and caught his shoulder in its grip with terrifying strength. He cried out, the sound sharp and ragged with agony. The creature lifted him half off his feet as though he weighed nothing. Its other hand clamped around his wrist. I heard bones shifting under the pressure. Baptiste kicked hard, landing solid blows against its midsection, but it did not release him. Pike closed the distance fast. His axe came down in a wide, powerful arc, sinking deep into the creature's side. It released a choked grunt and dropped Baptiste, who collapsed to his knees in the snow. Pike ripped the axe free with tremendous effort and struck again with all his strength. This time the blade split bone with a sickening crunch. The creature collapsed forward, its limbs twitching violently. Its breath whistled once through a punctured lung and then stopped entirely. The smell that rose from its body was foul beyond description, sharper than wet dog, stronger than any animal carcass I had ever encountered, with an underlying musk that turned the stomach. Pike stepped back, panting heavily, his face tight and pale beneath the blood spatter. The second creature closed rapidly on Voss. It moved with startling, unnatural speed, faster than the eye wanted to follow or accept. Voss dropped Eli and swung his saw handle up like a defensive stave. The creature caught the thick wood in its hands. The crack of splintering echoed sharply off the slope. Voss cursed fluently and fell back, fumbling desperately for the small axe at his belt. Jude ran in with a peavey and drove the iron spike into the creature's shoulder with youthful strength. It howled, a sound that mixed human and animal in equal measure, and turned on him with frightening speed. Its arm lashed out in a blur, striking Jude across the chest. He flew backwards into the snow, all air knocked cleanly from his lungs, wheezing desperately. I felt my legs shaking violently but forced myself to move forward with Eli still clutching at me. Hour released one of the oxen from its yoke and drove the massive animal forward with a desperate shout. The beast lowered its head and thundered straight into the creature's side with tremendous impact. The collision knocked the creature down hard. The ox trampled once with its full weight before bolting away in terror. The creature rolled with shocking agility, snarling deeply, then righted itself with disturbing ease. Its eyes reflected the lantern light that swung from Hour's belt. They glowed with an eerie, flat luminescence, unblinking as it crouched low, clearly preparing to spring again. Pike shouted for us to fall back to the landing immediately. He swung his bloody axe in wide warning arcs, forcing the creature to hesitate and calculate. Baptiste stumbled forward, clutching his mangled shoulder, his face pale with shock and blood loss. Voss half-dragged Eli, who groaned with each jarring step. Jude had gotten to his knees, gasping for air but determinedly pushing himself upright. Hour kept one hand on the last ox's yoke, steadying the terrified animal, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. We moved down the slope in a controlled retreat. Our backs never turned fully to the threat behind us. The creature followed with slow, deliberate movements, as though it understood perfectly well that we could not outpace it. Every few steps it rose tall, towering above us at its full, impossible height, then dropped low again into a hunting crouch. Its breath steamed heavily in the frigid air. Pike glanced back repeatedly, judging the distance to safety. His jaw clenched with tension. He stopped suddenly and swung his axe low across the snow, throwing up a spray of white that momentarily obscured vision. The sound and motion made the creature pause. It tilted its head in an oddly canine gesture, studying us with that flat, reflective gaze that showed far too much intelligence. Then, without any sound whatsoever, it turned and vanished into the line of spruce at the slope's edge. We did not believe it truly gone. Every man's ears strained for any sound of movement. Every eye flickered constantly toward the shadows, but no pursuit materialized. The landing opened around us, the frozen river channel cutting darkly through the white landscape, the stacks of cut timber standing like gray defensive walls. We dragged Eli to the nearest log pile and laid him on a folded coat. His ankle had swollen to nearly double its normal size. Jude coughed repeatedly until he spat blood into the snow. Baptiste's shoulder hung at an unnatural angle, his shirt dark and sodden with blood. Ours stood bent over with his hands braced on his knees, fighting for breath. Pike leaned heavily on his axe, scanning the tree line and the high ground behind us with exhausted vigilance. "We stay here tonight," he announced, his voice shaking once before steadying with effort. "No going back. No cutting timber. We keep the fire high and burning." He paused, then added, "If they come, we meet them here where there's open ground and room to fight." I suddenly realized that Nell's and the cookhouse sledge had not yet come down the slope. My stomach dropped with the realization. Pike must have seen the thought cross my face. "They'll follow at first light," he said, though he did not sound remotely certain of this. The oxen shifted restlessly in their traces, clearly unsettled. The smell of blood carried far on the cold air, an invitation and a challenge to every predator within miles. We built the fire high in the center of the landing, dragging kindling and split wood from the log pile. Flames rose tall and threw long, dancing shadows across the ice. Men huddled close to the heat, every head snapping toward each small sound from the surrounding trees. The wounded lay near the fire's warmth, groaning in low, pained breaths. Pike walked a wide, constant circle around our position, never letting his eyes rest on any single point for long. The night pressed down upon us with almost physical weight. At irregular intervals, we heard those uncanny calls rising from the cedar swamp. They sounded deeper now, and there were more than two voices moving in coordinated patterns around our exposed position. Each time the calls rose, the oxen moaned and tugged frantically at their yokes. Baptiste whispered prayers in French, his words stumbling and broken by waves of pain. Jude stared into the fire with a blank expression, his eyes wide and unblinking. Voss sharpened his axe with small, nervous strokes that grated louder than the fire's crackling. I sat with my hands pressed firmly on my knees, my heart beating hard enough that I could feel each pulse in my throat. My thoughts turned unbidden back to Silas, swallowed by the darkness beyond the cedar swamp. I knew with terrible certainty that he had not died cleanly or quickly. The way those creatures moved, the evident intelligence in their eyes, the calculated strength of their hands, all of it told me that Silas's end had been prolonged and awful. I wanted desperately to shut the thought away, but it remained steady and cold in my mind. The fire hissed as occasional snowflakes fell into the flames. Somewhere deep in the black trees, a branch cracked sharply under weight. It did not fall. It stayed pressed until it broke with a sound like a gunshot. The sound echoed through the forest. Pike raised his axe and faced the impenetrable darkness. "They're watching us," he said quietly, his voice low and meant only for those of us nearest. "Studying us." And so we waited through the endless hours for them to make their move. The fire burned high, but the warmth could not prevent fear from creeping steadily into every man's bones. Everyone leaned forward tensely, eyes darting ceaselessly to the tree line. The silence stretched unbearably, broken only by the occasional pop of sap igniting in burning wood. Eli shifted position and winced, his ankle swollen and angry beneath the crude cloth wrapping. Baptiste sat with his back pressed to the log pile, his good hand clamped over his ruined shoulder, his lips moving in silent prayer. Jude held the PV tightly across his lap, his breathing short and uneven from his earlier injury. The calls came again, but this time they were significantly closer. The sounds layered over each other in impossible harmony, 3 distinct voices at once, one high and keening, one low and rumbling, and one broken and stuttering between the 2 registers like a throat catching and releasing. The sound ran along the entire length of the tree line, circling our position, never remaining in one place long enough to fix its location. The oxen panicked completely, pulling until their wooden yokes strained and creaked. Our cursed steadily and tried desperately to calm them, but their eyes showed only whites, and they bellowed in absolute terror. Pike stepped to the fire and threw on additional wood. Sparks shot upward in a fountain, lighting his blood-stained face in harsh angles and deep shadows. "They want us to break," he said grimly. "To scatter. Stay tight together. They'll wait until one of us runs." His eyes swept deliberately over Jude, then Voss, then settled briefly on me. He knew which of us were nearest to breaking point. Minutes dragged past with agonizing slowness. Then a sudden crash of breaking branches split the darkness behind the log pile. Men whipped around as one. Lantern light caught a shape moving just beyond the reach of illumination, low and terrifyingly fast. Jude shouted and lunged to his feet, raising his PV. Pike barked his name sharply, but too late to stop him. Jude ran into the shadows, swinging wildly at nothing. The sound of his boots hitting the snow carried clearly, then abruptly ceased. We held absolutely still, waiting for his return, the fire crackling at our backs. Then came the scream, short, sharp, and cut off violently in the middle. After that, only the high, triumphant cry of something utterly inhuman answered, rising over the trees and echoing across the frozen landscape. Voss cursed savagely and started forward, but Pike blocked him with the flat of his axe. "No more," Pike said, his voice sharp as broken glass. "He's gone." Voss's face twisted with anguish and rage, but he did not push past. He dropped back to the fire, his hands shaking so badly that his axe nearly slipped from his grip. We sat again in stunned silence, the weight of what had just occurred settling like lead in our chests. The faint smell of iron drifted on the cold air, fresh blood on snow. I clenched my fists hard against my knees and tried to keep my eyes fixed on the fire. I wanted desperately to believe that Jude was still alive out there in the darkness, but the scream had been unmistakable. It was the sound of a life ending. Hours passed in terrible suspense. No direct attack came, only those circling calls, testing, probing, waiting with predatory patience. Men dozed in short, jerking fits, waking at each small sound. Pike never sat down. He walked the perimeter of our fire circle steadily and silently, his axe always gripped in his hand. When the first gray light of dawn finally touched the river ice, we moved immediately. Pike gave the order without any ceremony whatsoever. "Back to town," he said flatly. "We'll abandon the timber. The company can send another crew if they dare." No one argued. The decision had been made for us. We packed what little we had left with desperate speed. Eli was lifted carefully onto a sledge, his face pale as parchment but his jaw set with determination. Baptiste could barely use one arm, but he walked on his own, his eyes hollow and distant with shock. Auer lashed the oxen tight, speaking to them in a low, continuous murmur. Voss tied his axe to his belt with a strip of cloth so he would not lose it if forced to run. I carried the last functional lantern, its light weak and watery in the pale dawn. The path out ran long through the cedar swamp's edge. None of us wanted to pass through that cursed place again, but there was simply no alternative route. The trees leaned heavy with accumulated snow, and each gust of wind shook down a fine, obscuring fall that masked both sound and sight. We moved as quickly as Eli's injury allowed, but kept our line close and tight. Every man watched the brush as much as the trail ahead. Halfway through the cedar stand, the oxen suddenly balked. They snorted and flatly refused to take another step forward. Pike pushed ahead to drive them on with force if necessary. That was when the creatures appeared. 3 of them materialized at once, standing in a loose semicircle directly across our path. Tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, and fundamentally wrong in every proportion. Their eyes caught the weak dawn light, pale, flat, and utterly devoid of anything resembling mercy. They did not move at first. They simply watched us with that terrible, calculating intelligence. The oxen bellowed in primal terror and lunged sideways, nearly overturning the sledge with Eli lying helpless upon it. Auer fought the yoke desperately, his boots digging deep furrows in the snow. Voss shouted wordlessly. Baptiste raised his hook in his one functional hand. My lantern trembled violently in my grip, the flame fluttering and nearly extinguishing. The middle creature stepped deliberately forward. Its breath fogged out in steady, measured bursts. Its hands opened and closed rhythmically. The claws caught the dawn light, showing their full, terrible length. Pike raised his axe and shouted once, a wordless, defiant roar. His voice echoed through the swamp and died away into silence. For one endless moment, nothing moved. Then they came at us. The first creature hit Pike squarely, its full weight and momentum knocking him backwards. His axe swung in a defensive arc but caught only hide, cutting deep but failing to stop the creature's charge. The second rushed Baptiste with blinding speed, its claws sinking into his chest before he could swing his hook. He cried out once, a sound of pure agony, then was lifted clear off the ground, blood running hot and dark down the creature's muscular arm. The third went directly for the oxen, its jaws snapping with terrible force, sending the massive animals crashing into the sledges in blind panic. Eli rolled off the sledge, screaming as his injured ankle struck the frozen ground. I stumbled backwards, my lantern falling and dying in the snow, plunging us into gray dawn light. Voss roared and drove his axe deep into the side of the creature holding Baptiste. The blade sank to the haft, and the creature turned on him with frightening speed, releasing Baptiste's limp body. It fell with a wet thump to the snow. Auer swung his heavy yoke pin like a war club, striking the head of the beast mauling the oxen. The sound was flat and horrible, bone meeting iron with tremendous force. The creature staggered but did not fall. Pike regained his feet, his axe blade red with blood, his face set in grim determination. He struck again and again, each blow heavy and precise, each breath ragged with exhaustion. One creature went down, thrashing and clawing at the snow, but the others closed in tighter, working with clear coordination. Eli dragged himself desperately through the snow toward the tree line, his face twisted with pain and abject terror. I reached for him, but something moved between us with impossible speed, tall and fast. It bent low with predatory grace, and Eli's cry cut short with horrible finality. When it rose again, he was gone, carried away in its arms like a child's doll. The landing and its fire seemed a lifetime away now, an impossible distance. Only the breaking of wood, the agonized cries of men, and the low, triumphant snarls of the creatures filled the swamp. I knew then with absolute certainty that we would not all survive to see the road out. Pike drove his axe into the ribs of the creature before him with desperate strength, but the thing hardly faltered. It twisted its head and snapped its massive jaws close to his face, close enough that I could see strings of saliva connecting the yellowed teeth. Pike wrenched the blade free, his arms trembling with the enormous effort required. Voss leapt beside him, striking the same beast with his axe in a downward hack that split flesh and muscle, spattering blood in a wide arc across the pristine snow. The creature shuddered violently and fell hard, but another pressed in immediately from the side, forcing them backwards toward the wrecked sledge. Baptiste lay absolutely still where he had been dropped. His chest did not rise. His eyes stared open and blank, frost already creeping at the edges and across his eyeballs. Auer shouted his name once in anguish but did not stop swinging his yoke pin. He struck one beast across the shoulder with such force that bone cracked audibly. The blow staggered it backwards, but it did not fall. It turned its head slowly toward Auer, its lips curling back over yellow teeth, dark blood trailing down its thick, fur-covered arm. I lifted the PV I had dropped earlier and stepped to Hour's side, my hands shaking so badly I could barely maintain my grip. The beast rushed toward Hour with claws raised high, but I jammed the iron spike into its thigh with everything I possessed. The iron sank deep into muscle, and the creature howled, a sound that mixed agony and fury in equal measure. It staggered sideways. Hour swung hard at its jaw with the yoke pin, and the massive head snapped back with a sickening crack. The creature crumpled to the snow, twitching once before going entirely still. The last beast circled Pike and Voss with clear intelligence. It was larger than the others had been, shoulders impossibly broad, arms hanging longer than any man's arms should reach, its breath steaming in great clouds. Its chest heaved with exertion, but its eyes remained fixed with unwavering focus on the two bloodied men who stood defiant before it. Pike raised his axe, but his arm shook with complete exhaustion. Voss spat blood from his split lip and squared his stance, both hands white-knuckled on his axe handle. The creature lunged with speed that defied belief. It slammed into Voss and carried him down into the snow. White powder burst up around them in a cloud. Voss roared, swinging wildly, but the beast pinned him with one massive arm and raked across his chest with the other. The sound of tearing cloth and flesh turned my stomach. Voss screamed once, a sound of pure, animal agony, then fell silent as the creature tore into him with savage efficiency. Pike struck from behind, burying his axe deep in the creature's broad back. The beast reared up with a guttural, choking cry, twisting violently, the axe still lodged deep between its shoulder blades. It swung one arm in a wide arc and struck Pike squarely in the chest with bone-breaking force. He flew backwards, landing hard on the ice near the wrecked sledge, all breath driven from his body. He tried desperately to rise but collapsed again, clutching his ribs. Hour and I stood alone against this final horror. My breath came fast and shallow, creating small clouds in the frigid air. The PV in my trembling hands felt utterly inadequate against the mass of muscle, claw, and primal fury before us. The beast turned slowly toward Pike, dragging Voss's limp, broken body half-crushed in the bloody snow. It bent low, its jaws opening impossibly wide. I shouted without conscious thought, a raw sound that tore my throat. The creature's head lifted toward me. Its eyes caught mine, cold and flat and empty of anything I could recognize as emotion. I charged with the spike raised and drove it with all the strength I possessed into its side. The iron slid between ribs with a terrible, grating sensation. The beast roared, twisting violently, clawing at the embedded weapon. Hour ran in and slammed his yoke pin against its skull with devastating force. Once, twice. The second blow cracked bone with a sound like a branch breaking. The creature staggered, swung one heavy arm, and caught Hour squarely across the neck. He dropped without making a sound, his body limp before it hit the ground. I tore the PV free with a spray of dark blood and struck again, driving the spike high into the creature's throat. Blood poured black against the white snow, far too much blood for anything to survive. The creature collapsed to its knees, a horrible gurgling sound emerging from the wound in its throat. Its eyes remained fixed on me even as life fled from them. It swayed once, then toppled face-first into the snow. The ground shook with the impact of its tremendous weight. The silence that followed rang in my ears like a physical pressure. Only my ragged, desperate breathing broke it. The fire from the landing was long behind us now. The swamp lay still and cold, holding its terrible secrets in the frozen dawn light. Pike groaned from where he lay crumpled against the wrecked sledge. He dragged himself slowly upright, clutching his ribs, his face pale and drawn with pain. He looked methodically at the bodies of the men scattered around us in the bloody snow, Baptiste, Voss, Hour, all dead or dying. His eyes held no words, only a terrible, hollow comprehension. There were 2 of us left standing from a crew of 9 men. The oxen, driven mad by the prolonged violence and the smell of blood, had broken free during the final struggle and fled into the forest. The sledges lay wrecked and useless, one overturned completely, one smashed half to pieces. Tools and supplies were scattered everywhere, most stained red against the white snow. The tree line loomed dark and silent now, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was not truly empty. The calls had stopped, yes, but that silence felt worse than the sounds had been. It felt like the pause between breaths, the moment before another hunt would begin. Pike pressed a hand firmly to his side and forced himself to his feet through sheer determination. "We move," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whilst we still can." I nodded, though my legs felt ready to give way beneath me at any moment. I lifted the blood-slick peavey again and turned toward what I desperately hoped was the road leading back to civilization. The snow had already begun to fall again, covering the bodies with a merciful white shroud. In the terrible stillness of the swamp, the silence did not feel remotely like safety. It felt precisely like the pause before another hunt would begin, before fresh predators would arrive, drawn by the smell of so much spilled blood. We walked on through the endless forest, two broken, exhausted men abandoning the timber, the dead, and any hope of salvaging this cursed season. Behind us lay the memory of voices that would never leave my ears for as long as I lived. That winter, I made it back to the nearest town. Pike did as well, though his ribs never healed properly. They clicked and ground with every breath for the rest of his days. We never spoke of what we had witnessed to outsiders. Not to the logging company representatives who came asking questions. Not to the families of the men who never returned home. Not to the sheriff who perfunctorily investigated the incident. The official story was wolves, or possibly a rogue bear driven mad by early waking from hibernation. We let them believe it. What else could we do? Who would have believed the truth? Pike and I shared one conversation about it, late one night in a tavern, both of us well into our cups. He looked at me with haunted eyes and said simply, "We tell the truth, they lock us in an asylum. We stay silent, we stay free. Those are the only choices." But I know what I saw in that cedar swamp. I know what walked upright through those frozen woods on two legs whilst possessing the head and claws of a wolf. I know the intelligence I saw in those flat, reflective eyes. I know the calculated patience with which they stalked us, testing our defenses, waiting for weakness. The logging company sent another crew the following autumn. Only 3 men returned from that expedition, and they returned early, abandoning their equipment and fleeing in the night. The company quietly closed that particular tract and never returned. The timber still stands there, untouched, growing slowly over the bones of the men we left behind. I left the logging trade entirely after that season. The forest no longer felt like a place where honest work could be done. It felt like a place that belonged to something older than us, something that tolerated our presence only until it decided otherwise. Even now, decades later, when the wind rises at night and carries across the frozen land, I sometimes hear it, that sound that holds 2 voices at once, one layered impossibly over the other. And in those moments, I am back in that shanty in Wexford County, listening to something that should not exist circling our camp in the darkness, patient and hungry and utterly inhuman. They are still there in those deep woods. Still waiting. Still hunting. And God help anyone who ventures too deep into their territory when winter comes again. Historical note. This account was transcribed from a handwritten manuscript discovered in the estate papers of a Michigan timber worker who died in 1923. The manuscript was never published during his lifetime. Several other similar accounts from Michigan's logging era describe encounters with creatures matching this description, though all were dismissed as folklore or the products of isolation and harsh conditions. The Wexford County logging camp referenced in this account was never successfully relocated by historians, though timber company records from 1887 to 1888 do show an unusual number of abandoned operations in that region during the period in question. Make of that what you will.